All right, everyone, we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks for bearing with the late room change and logistics, but appreciate you being here. So this is the Cordell Institute's sponsored panel on AI's impact on healthcare. Today I am joined by three experts here at Washington on these areas. Professor Richard is an expert on privacy law and innovation. He also was the CPO for 23andMe this summer, looking at their issues around the potential sale of data. Chen-Yang Li is the director of the AI for Health Institute here, and also a Fulbright professor of computer science and engineering. And Professor Rachel Sachs, professor of law specializing in healthcare and innovation law. So with that said, I will offer up sort of a softball for the panel, but one I'd like to kind of open with a discussion, which is AI has been sort of touted both in this event so far, these legal tech weeks, and just generally. There's no way to sort of avoid it in the common discourse. What areas do you see right now, particularly in healthcare, that are most promising and are leading to the biggest sort of changes, both on the policy side, but also on the technological side? What do you see as right now the areas you would say this is where we're seeing the biggest growth or potential? So, Rachel, if you don't mind, sorry.
But one thing to note about the healthcare context is that we've been using algorithms writ large or sort of technologies like that in different types of healthcare products for quite some time. And so a lot of the regulatory agencies, a lot of the physicians, healthcare professionals have adapted to the use of things like, hey, we're doing imaging in a way that's going to think differently about how we look at these images, how we diagnose conditions based on an X-ray, a CT scan, an MRI. And so FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, has already had to think about what does it mean to include software of any type in medical devices. What do we do? One really big change that's leading to the kinds of disruptions that you're suggesting is this growth in generative AI, or this change to generative AI, and what does that do? How does that change the practice environment? How does that change the way that we think about what's possible, both from a positive perspective and also what are we worried about? So some of the, in my view, most interesting types of technologies we're seeing are things like ambient scribes, right? So a long time concern that physicians have had is documentation. Some people may have had the experience of going to the doctor or healthcare professional, and there's someone else in the room who's helping the healthcare provider take notes. They're helping them record everything so that the healthcare professional can focus on. I've already managed to dissuade people from this conversation. So there's someone helping them make sure that they're getting the information down so the healthcare professional can focus on the patient, what they need to ask the patient, the information they need to get. Maybe you don't need a person to do that. Maybe you can have an ambient AI model in the background, taking notes, figuring out what's important from this conversation. Are those AI models, how good are they at actually recording or not recording the conversation, but analyzing and processing that conversation into a note? Is it doing what the physician or healthcare professional needs it to do, whether that's for billing purposes or insurance purposes? Is it decreasing the amount of time that the healthcare professional is needing to spend writing the note themselves, right? There's sort of mixed results in some of the studies on this. So that's one piece of technology that's particularly important. Another one that maybe I want to highlight is that AI models are being used not just by healthcare professionals or in the healthcare delivery setting, but also in the administration setting. So many of you took my health law class last year, and you know that we talked about the use of AI tools or other natural language processing to decide whether a patient is entitled to a particular form of care, right? So can these models be used by insurance companies to say, no, we don't think the patient's file merits this particular form of treatment? That can be more problematic from a policy perspective, especially if you think that the model isn't doing a particularly good job of explaining itself when it says that this person shouldn't be entitled to this particular form of care.
Yep, it's great to follow Rachel because scribing is definitely the biggest thing that's happening in the AI for health space. There are many startup companies. The biggest electronic health records company, Epic, just announced they are doing scribing as well. So this is happening, and BJC Healthcare is rolling this out as we speak, right? So if you in the very near future or now, if you go to see a doctor, you will see this being, your conversation being recorded and then summarized into notes right now. There's indeed profound potential implications of what this means to healthcare. We had a really nice discussion at the AI for Health Symposium about this recently, last week, in fact. I'll add a couple. So the first one, I guess, is chatbot, right? Of course, everyone is using chatbot, and it turns out this was also discussed at the AI Health Symposium, where Harvard Business Review recently published an article that basically surveyed how people are using chatbot. Maybe I can ask you as well, right? How are you using a ChatGPT and so forth? It turns out the largest application usage is mental health support. It turns out people just have long conversations with chatbot about their distressing situations and and so forth, right? So this has profound and implications, right? Of course, you probably have seen in the news sometime very bad consequences, right, from these chatting with AI, but people are going for it. Right, so there's, any mental health researcher and professionals would tell you, don't do it, right? Because the chatbots are not designed for mental health support, but people do it anyway, right? So this is definitely something that's very much related to health. That a lot of people are working to figure this out. The second one is actually something that people have been working on for a long time. These are clinical decision support systems, right, for clinicians, right? These are, now of course the new buzzword for it is the co-pilot, right? So every physician, right, is going to have a co-pilot where the AI is processing the data, the AI is making recommendations about what are the potential diagnoses of this patient given the data we are seeing. What are the predictions about what's going to happen? What are the treatment response, right, to different form of treatment? There's really tremendous potential for it. And in this day and age, we see a lot of foundation models, right? Foundation model meaning models that are trained on huge amount of data, right? How about the Epic recent model that's trained on over 130 million patients' data, right? So these models are a lot more intelligent and versatile and make predictions about all kinds of potential outcomes. Again, there's, of course, they are not always right? And they are not always generalizable to different populations and hospital systems and so forth. So there's, again, profound implications that we are figuring this out.
There was a joke one of my computer scientist friends told me, which is that I understand we have a real computer scientist here, so you can tell me if it's A, accurate, and B, funny. I also so Rachel, you're at 1, and Qinyang, you're at 0. So we'll see if I can drive more people from the room during my remarks. The joke goes something like this: when computer scientists and they sort of chat among themselves, when they're talking to the press, they say artificial intelligence. When they're applying for funding, they say machine learning. And when they're talking among themselves, they say algorithms. And I think one of the, and we'll get into this more, I'm sure, over the hour, one of the great dangers that we have is hype. And one of the great problems that we, AI hype, one of the great problems that we have is figuring out exactly what we are talking about when we are talking about artificial intelligence. Because under the umbrella of artificial intelligence is a whole host of technologies, everything from TikTok's recommendation algorithm to protein folding research software to what we typically mean when we say artificial intelligence, which is generative artificial intelligence in general and ChatGPT-5 in particular. And I think it's really important as we talk about these things as a society, as we talk about these things as lawyers, to be careful what we mean when we say this term. Because I think if all we're talking about are algorithms, and ultimately that is all we're talking about, we have been dealing with these problems in my field, privacy law, for 30 years. Obviously, something at the level of hype is meaningfully different now, and something at the level of technology seems to be meaningfully different now in terms of capabilities. But I think in addition to the generative examples that we've already discussed, which are tremendously important, I think we're going to see the replacement of human beings in scheduling and in sort of management of patients. And it's as anybody who's tried to argue with a telephone reception chatbot has pointed out, that's kind of dangerous. I think we also need to talk a lot more about smaller AI models. I think the Sam Altmans and the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world have as is their wants, stolen so much oxygen out of the room that things like diagnostic assistance imaging for pathologists and determining, is this blurry image a potential cancer, or is it just schmutz on the lens, and figuring those sorts of things out are important. Biomedical research, basic research tools like the one that models the folding of proteins to find new compounds, protecting new treatments are important. And I think there's an awful lot of issues around the data that is being collected and that is being used for that we need to be mindful of and approach with our critical faculties.
Yeah. So kind of following up on what you'd mentioned, Professor Sachs, the two administrations in the last few years couldn't be more different sort of on their overall approach and what they think about regulating or slowing down or being in front of, depending how you want to frame it, AI. How do you see the approach we have now impacting in the healthcare space, both for good or for ill? And where do you see this sort of changing fundamentally what we're looking at?
Yeah, so this is a great question. How many of you are in Professor Jury's class right now? Okay, some of you, but not most of you. So I don't want to maybe get into too far into the AI action plan, right? What it covers, what it doesn't cover. But in healthcare, we have seen already, the Biden administration began to put out a series of rules, very much sort of under the radar, about things like, can a Medicare Advantage plan use a proprietary algorithm to deny care to a patient? Or if you want to include a predictive clinical algorithm in your electronic medical record, what standards do you need to meet? So says the Office of the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology. And those were things that began to be rolled out under the Biden administration, but they'll take several years to phase in part because the technology is still evolving, and in part because, right, some of the industry standards of what it means to actually do these things are still very much under development. So it's hard to, so for now, right, what appears to be the case is that those rules have not yet been changed or rolled back in ways that would weaken their force. Now, many would say they weren't particularly strong to begin with, right? But even in the absence of congressional action, we did see CMS, ONC start to take action around the role of AI in the healthcare delivery system. Now, at the same time, we've seen this administration be very interested in the promise of AI in ways that may accord more with Professor Richards' framing around hype. So for example, we saw the FDA commissioner talking about an AI tool that was going to transform or really cut down on the amount of time it took the agency to review a new healthcare technology in terms of its safety and efficacy. But we had seen subsequent media reports that talked to people at the agency who say, no, it's hallucinating all kinds of things. It can't reliably tell me what's actually in the application. It's just not ready to do the kinds of things that the commissioner says publicly that it's going to do. So we do have some examples of this administration trying to push things forward that maybe aren't quite ready to get there. Another example, or another sort of maybe something that's ongoing, is there are lots of people thinking about questions of how do we ensure standards, how do we ensure quality of some of these algorithms that would not be regulated by the Food and Drug Administration, that would not be regulated by Medicare in some way. And there are various private organizations like the Coalition for Health Artificial Intelligence that were sort of started to try to do some of this. This administration seems to be very hostile to some of those organizations. It's not entirely clear if they think there's something that should replace them. If so, what that should be. But if you thought that there was a burgeoning role for private actors to perform a sort of quality assurance function, or at least a know what AI models are being run in your healthcare system, and maybe we should all be on the same page about that function, that might be lessening now than it was before.
And Professor Liu, you'd mentioned this before, but the amount of data we have, it's pretty staggering in a lot of these contexts, but there's still errors, there's still blind spots. How are you seeing the system sort of deal with that and identify these blind spots? And where are you seeing either, encouraging developments or acknowledgement that maybe this doesn't work quite as well as we think it does?
Yeah. I'll tell you a story. So recently I went to the BJH, Barnes-Jewish Hospital Medical Staff Association, right? So they had a meeting, they say, why don't you come in and tell us about AI for health? So I went to give a talk, right? This is the association of all the doctors, right? So of Barnes-Jewish Hospital with all these different departments. And they gave the talk, right? So after the talk, I said questions, right? The first question I got was, are these, recommendations and predictions made by the models recorded in the electronic health records, right? Turns out what they are worried about, what if the AI recommends one way, I that went for a different, treatment plan and end up, right, the patient got a bad outcome, right? So, and then am I liable? Am I in trouble?
Yeah.
Right? So my first reaction to that, man, I need a lawyer in here, right? So because, right, so but what this tells us seriously is if we can't figure out the liability, right, distribution and the regulations, this is going to have a hard time, right, getting adoption, right, in real world clinics, right? So, so what was the original question?
Around the data and where you're seeing both how AI is working well and where it's not, and how have you seen us either grasping some of that potential or being willing to back up and say, hey, there's issues here, we should slow down and think about it?
Right. So, well, one thing about AI is, as Neil said earlier, it will never be always right. Right? It's a matter of degree depending on the particular medical domain, right? In certain, for example, imaging diagnosis is getting quite accurate, right? So, but then there are sort of trickier problems such as mental health, for example. It's a lot harder to get a very highly accurate model. So the struggle right now is this clinician and AI relationship. How do they collaborate the most effectively, right? The idea is, in an ideal world, you want, when the AI is right, the clinician listen to the AI and follow it. When the AI is wrong, the clinician should detect it and then reject it and make your own decisions, right? How do you get there, right? This goes down to the issue of transparency, right? In a sense, AI should not just give you a black box prediction. I magically decide, this person will have cancer or not, right? But rather, you have to explain, right? This is the so-called model explanation. Right? You explain what are the different factors that's driving the model to make this prediction so that clinician could judge, right? This is nonsense because explanation doesn't make sense. And you can make some estimate about uncertainty, right? Do you realize when you use ChatGPT always sounds so annoyingly confident, right? Even when it's saying nonsense, right? That's a classical case of the model does not have good calibration with regard to uncertainty and doesn't communicate, right, the degree of uncertainty about its answers, right? So there's a lot of work, including my own group's work, is about how do you put uncertainty, right, mechanisms into the model so that the model would also convey to the clinicians, this is my level of confidence, right, in this prediction, so that it will hopefully help the clinician make better decisions. Right. So you will never get a perfect model. I can guarantee you that.
Yes.
Right. But there are ways that we can endeavor to address that problem in relation to human operators.
And kind of building on that, a question Professor Richards, really for the panel as well, is looking at that, there's been a lot of talk about how to regulate. There's discussion about preempting all AI regulation across states. There's discussion of preempting only federal. There's all these How are we looking at that both in context with what the administration wants to do now and sort of how you view how we build up regulatory controls around AI, both for healthcare and elsewhere?
Yeah, well, I'll have to be sure that I answer this question with the appropriate degree of modesty about my certainty about my conclusions here. But actually, I think this one is actually, so let me model it. This one's actually pretty clear, right? There's a stark difference here, in addition to the ones that Professor Sachs pointed out, between the current administration and the previous one. The previous one was concerned about things like bias in AI and about bad data sets or biased data sets, but and particularly in medicine, where if you don't have demographically varied data sets, you can replicate the problems that happen in data driven or pre-AI computerized medicine, where all of the test subjects were people who looked like me and were my age and my gender. And you would have different consequences of treatments in different populations and subpopulations. The new administration also seems to be starkly anti-regulation of any sorts, in a way that to my mind is reckless, both as to the nature of AI and also as to the nature of the risks that AI poses. So in the so-called even saying these words hurts my mouth. Big beautiful bill. In the spring, one of the provisions that was in the bill was a preemption of all AI regulation by states that was going to last for 10 years. And this passed the House. And it got to the Senate, where led by Missouri Senator Josh Hawley, the Senate defeated the measure 99-1, which I think shows in our polarized age, if the Senate rejects something the administration puts out by 99-1, you can see what a really wholly dumb idea it would be to preempt AI regulation, particularly because there's no appetite or capacity for Congress to pass national privacy or AI regulation. In the last 25 years, while Congress has failed every year to pass privacy law, the states have stepped into the gap and have filled the gap with perhaps not adequate or sufficient, with a whole bunch of important small to medium level protections for data, health data, and non-health data. And I think, I know that the appetite to preempt AI regulation by the states continues. That the Senate the House Judiciary Committee held hearings about a month ago on this question. They tried to bring it back, and with Ryan's help with the comments, I testified on behalf of the Cordell Institute opposing AI preemption, citing such examples as, well, does this mean that states will not be able to regulate the validity of tests that are AI produced for the practice of medicine? Does this mean that states are not going to be able to regulate hallucination of AI citations by lawyers who are lazy enough to use generative AI to write their briefs for them? And I think this is a stark contrast. And I think one of the great dangers here is that there's a perhaps pun intended, there's a meta-narrative, not necessarily put forth by Meta, but benefiting Meta, a sort of super narrative that we're hearing that national AI policy should be driven first and foremost by a national security deathmatch struggle, zero-sum game against China. And they should be driven to develop artificial general intelligence faster than the Chinese researchers produce, unless anything is subsidiary to that struggle. So there's a continued push to have no AI regulation, to take the brakes off. And to my mind, and to the mind of 99 of the 100 senators in the US Senate, that's a really, really bad idea. Yeah, please.
So just to jump in on this and maybe bring together two threads of the conversation so far, there is this question about what's the proper way to regulate AI models if we want to regulate them. So one way is ex ante regulation. You can think about, the Food and Drug Administration is going to regulate certain types of medical devices before they enter the market. There's lots of reasons why we think that's an appropriate thing to do. But there's other situations where we might say, no, the appropriate regulatory model is ex post liability, right? If the AI model does something that harms someone, what you should do is be able to bring a lawsuit. And so to your point, point about is someone going to sue me, we've also often thought that medical malpractice liability, right after there's a potential harm that's related to a medical encounter, right, a medical visit of some type, that liability in tort law is the better way of dealing with the potential harms that might occur. But there are specific domains like medical devices, like pharmaceuticals, where we've said, no, we really need to regulate these things before they come on the market. There's lots of reasons why we would do that. And then AI models, right, fit into all of these different categories. So even if FDA is regulating a particular technology, they're saying, hey, we're going to use it in an MRI machine in this particular way. FDA is only regulating that model. They're not regulating the deployment of that model. They're not regulating how is the physician incorporating it into medical practice, right? How is it being used? And when that does happen, who do you sue? Do you sue the developer of the model? Do you sue the physician? How do we think about the difference between in law, we might say products liability framework versus a negligence framework for thinking about what type of liability we should have and where. And we could have different answers in somewhat different contexts. Another sort of difference that people have used to talk about this is, are the states regulating the use of AI, or are they regulating the development of AI? Because it seems to many people, perhaps not all people, but to many people, that a state could reasonably, as many states have, say, hey, you know that thing that CMS did at the federal level with Medicare Advantage plans when they said they can't use proprietary algorithms to deny care? We want to say that for the insurance companies in our state too, and we want to limit their ability to deny care on the basis of using these AI models, or we want to disclose to a patient if an AI model is being used to respond to a query they've sent their healthcare professional through an online portal, right? Those types of regulations or laws, right, whatever they might be, around the use of AI strike a lot of people as very different than a state trying to regulate whether and how you can develop AI technologies in the first place.
I'll say, all these AI health researchers, startup funders, right? We all, worry and agonize about all these regulation issues. I like to use this analogy of autonomous vehicles, right, running on streets, right, versus sort of AI for health, where AI help clinicians make decisions. So you wouldn't have no regulation to have autonomous vehicles, right, driving on our street. Right, you have very strict regulations, right? As also a lot of those are local regulations as well. So we all think, there's no question that you need some regulations, right? So otherwise, it's just simply irresponsible. The problem is, of course, now the liability or responsibility is distributed, right? So now, as Rachel just said, there's a developer who is responsible for getting the model right. There is a hospital system that's deploying the model across the clinics that have certain responsibility in deploying it, right? Then there's the clinicians who are still making the decisions, right? So with just this AI co-pilot making suggestions, still your responsibility to try to make the right decisions, hopefully with some help of uncertainty measurements and explanations, right? So this is such a complex issue for technologists to figure out, right? Like, where the liability lie and how it's distributed and in what situations, right? For legal mind, I think this is such a wonderfully complicated problem to try to do research on and figure out. And it has tremendous implications, because if you don't do it right, then you can easily get two consequences. One is it's not safe, it's going to hurt a lot of people. Or you're going to make it so, so disincentivize, right, technology development, and doctors are saying, I'm not going to use AI tool, right? Even if it could potentially improve my effectiveness by 90%, but just that 10% of trouble is enough, right, to not use it, right? And for startup companies, right, the big worry is, if I cannot market this, right? If in the end of the day, after millions of dollars invested, no hospital is going to deploy it and no clinician is going to use it because of all these, liability issues, then that, big tech economy will just go away, and we won't have innovation that's truly do good, right, with AI to healthcare.
Now, there's a joke out that I like talking about. OpenAI is trying to get insurance, or they're self-insuring right now. They have a plan for that, but the idea was, you need to walk into an insurance adjuster and say, well, what's your risk? And the response is going to be, well, if it's society ending, what's 20% of everything? That's how much your premium is. So thinking about that sort of risk, how do you draw that line in between?
They could pay that soon.
They probably, they might have it.
I mean, I think in the health area, I completely agree that I think one of the interesting things about health as opposed to other areas of technology policy is there is much more of a consensus that some kind of reasonable regulation is necessary in order for physicians to be able to provide care to patients, because we're all patients at one time or another in our lives in ways that is safe and effective and hopefully affordable and accessible as well. I think one of the dangers here, though, is outside of health, technology companies resist ex ante regulation of the sort that Professor Sachs pointed out as stifling innovation. We can unpack that ideological mess if we want in a little bit, but it's nonsense. And then afterwards, for the ex ante regulation, they say, well, we really don't want it to be a private right of action because that will be bad for profits. We will also chill or stifle innovation. So they want to be immunized on both sides. And then if there is regulation, this is outside health, they bring constitutional First Amendment challenges to it as sort of infringing their ability to share data. And I think that the challenge here is when we talk about health, we have a well-regulated sphere, a well-defined sphere, FDA regulation and HIPAA for data. But technologies like generative AI tend to transcend those increasingly quaint seeming 20th century divisions of the world. I saw a report yesterday that ChatGPT received something like 1 million instances of suicidal ideation a week from people who are using it as and I may get this term wrong because I'm not a health scholar, an off-label sort of mental health therapist. And I think that is something that should give us all pause about the ways in which, as lawyers, the ways in which our existing legal categories are insufficiently adapted to track evolutions in technology and business models. That even if we agree there's a consensus, we should have reasonable regulation of health as health expands to cover more kinds of data and more kinds of technologies.
Well, thank you. I think you teed up my next question quite well with that then. Given that we do have sort of in some ways antiquated or not fully covering laws in healthcare and around data around these issues, where would you like to see interventions? I think in myself particularly around like apps or things that fall outside HIPAA, that fall out some traditional regulation by FDA, et cetera. Where would you, if in a perfect world, where would you want to see interventions or sort of policy making moving quicker than it is?
So maybe I'll answer this a little bit more obliquely by talking about some of the challenges in regulating the healthcare system sort of writ large. So as those of you who took my health law class know, we have a very fragmented healthcare system. And so if about half of people are insured through private insurance, a big portion of people have Medicare, a smaller number, more people have Medicaid than have Medicare, but still smaller than the number of people who have private insurance. There are ways where different actors can regulate different parts of that, but not as fully as we'd like. So states, it's very difficult because of a doctrine called ERISA preemption, which I'm not going to talk very much about. It's very difficult for states to regulate the insurance practices for most people in the state who have commercial insurance because of the ways companies self-insure. It exempts them from certain forms of state regulation, but we're not likely, for the reasons that we've talked about and people might be aware of, to have comprehensive federal regulation in the near term. And so Medicare can say, for Medicare Advantage especially, this is what we want plans to be allowed to do and not allowed to do. States could say, within our Medicaid programs, here is what the private insurance companies that contract with us as the state are going to be allowed to do or not. But states have very limited ability to regulate what private insurance companies can do, or well, employers serving as sort of insurers can do in their state. So there are gaps that are sort of well known in our ability to engage in certain types of regulation. And those are likely to be maybe highlighted by some of these changing technologies. Maybe one asterisk I want to say, because I don't think anyone has really said it yet. You know, we've talked about what are some of the errors that the AI models might make. we should be completely open about the prospect or likelihood or even certainty that some of these AI models, they'll make mistakes, but they're still better
Yep.
Yeah.
than clinicians, right? So they might make fewer mistakes even today than clinicians, or they might still need some time to get better, but they will make fewer mistakes. Maybe the mistakes they will make are different in kind, right? How does that help us think about what kind of regulation might be necessary? But if you think they're already better, right, at least in some of these areas, how does that influence what type of regulation you might want and under what circumstances?
We certainly heard about discussions where humans are much less forgiving about mistakes made by AI, right, versus human ourselves, right? So this happened to autonomous vehicle already, right? Like human drivers make mistakes and we get into accident, right? So that happens all the time and we don't sort of make a huge fuss about it usually, right? But whenever, right, a Tesla or a different autonomous vehicle get into an accident, that's huge, right, headline news and got a lot of pushback about it, right? Same is true in medicine. And thank you for bringing this up, right? So indeed, right, our physicians make a lot of mistakes as well, unfortunately, right? So in a lot of cases, actually AI does it a lot better. There was actually a recent study, I think it was a Microsoft study that actually showed that the AI, actually the particular instance of AI, actually when it did diagnostic tasks, like it's a sequential diagnostic task on like real patients' data in comparison to sort of family doctors, essentially. I think it's something about, I can't remember the precise number, it's a huge difference. It's like 3 times more accurate or
Yeah.
1/3 of the errors or something like that, right? So would you use a human family doctor? We were discussing it at the AI Health Symposium. Would you use a human doctor knowing it's only 1/3 as accurate, right, in comparison to AI? Right? So that's sort of the big question, right? Back to the regulation, I would say we really need clarity, right, in terms of liability, right? So how do you put our clinicians into peace of mind? It's okay for me to use this AI tool and look at its recommendations and make decisions, right? So we also really need clarity on what AI models are okay to market, right? So I think right now FDA is basically saying everything is a medical device, and I'm not sure that always really, well, yeah, I'll defer to you on what's happening, but in general, there's doesn't seem to be the regulations that's really tailored for what really AIs are right now.
Yeah, I mean, how long do we have? I have had both the challenge and the privilege of working in the field for 25 years where there's a lot less law. And so a lot more of what we do as law professors in sort of privacy technology law is think about gaps rather than established regulatory frameworks. And I think I can think of several things that I would like to see, particularly focused around data and the way that data, health data, and data that is potentially relevant to health, which is actually all data with sort of large scale data analytics, is regulated. First, the United States is the only country in the world that doesn't have a comprehensive privacy statute, which means that data that falls outside of HIPAA is covered under, and this few students from privacy law class here now will know, under a very low level. Did you read the privacy policy? Did you nonetheless decide, and the answer would be no. Did you nonetheless decide to use the service? And that's insufficient, particularly as there is so much health data that falls outside HIPAA, because HIPAA only covers information that is provided to a doctor or a hospital by a patient that is related to a healthcare transaction for which insurance is reimbursing the pay or paying for the healthcare, which means Apple Watches, it means WebMD, it means ChatGPT as a mental health bot, it means concierge medicine or anything that insurance doesn't cover is all outside. And so I would like to see a general baseline protection for data, of data security and data minimization and entities only collecting the data they need. I'd also like to see second some substantive duties. I think it's important, given the power of these models, to treat them as something like fiduciaries. The way a doctor is a fiduciary of a patient, I think so too should ChatGPT be a fiduciary of teenage children who are using it to discuss whether or not they should kill themselves. There's litigation going on around this right now. So that means imposing three basic, old, and common law established duties: a duty of confidentiality, which means you don't share the data outside the transaction for which it is used. You don't use it for your own purposes. Second, a duty of care to really take account of the foreseeable harms akin to negligence, but think about what is foreseeable in ordinary human uses of these technologies, and to hold companies accountable, or companies or physicians using them, or generally. And third, loyalty, making sure that the data that is collected and the operation of the technology is used in ways that do not betray the vulnerable human on the other side of these technologies. And third, and finally, we need to retain something like HIPAA for health data, and think about how to expand HIPAA to cover the excluded health data uses which modern technology has used to break this other existing legal category, and to do that in a way that doesn't affect general privacy regulation, doesn't affect specific privacy regulation like duties of loyalty, and also doesn't break the healthcare system.
I really like you bringing up the data issue, right? So I want to mention that technology actually exists to keep the data private, right? But still allowing you to do good AI, because a lot of the big argument is, to build a powerful and generalizable AI, I have to pull all these data together. I have to pull population data together, I have to pull data from different hospitals. But in reality, there are technologies like federated learning, right? This is a technology where I'm sure a lot of you have used some keyboard on your phone, right? Like the Google keyboard called Gboard, right? So it does, you type a few letters, it give you a word, give you a selection of words, right? It's AI work, right? So that's guessing what words you're trying to type. And you might worry that if you think about it, is this Google looking at my typing and then try to guess what I'm trying to type? That would be horrible, right? In reality, whatever you are typing never left your phone, right? This is something called federated learning, where you have a little machine learning model running on the phone that's trying to do some training based on your data. Then it sends some kind of intermediate sort of model parameter representation to Google, and then it pulls all these sort of intermediate result and train a better model, and then feed it back to your phone. But the bottom line is whatever you're typing never left your phone, right? And people are doing the same with clinical data in hospitals, right? So you don't need to get Massachusetts General and BJC to pull their data together, which would be a lot of privacy implications, but rather it's possible to do federated learning where you train these models separately in different hospital systems. Then you send the intermediate results to kind of central coordinator entity, then feed back these model parameters, so that again, you have the sort of assurance where the data never left, right, at the hospital where you got treated. So there's no reason for things like federated learning not to be adopted everywhere as like basic building blocks for health AI. So,
Well, I think that there's also just one quick
please.
little point. I think this goes back to the question about what we mean when we say artificial intelligence, right? That if we're talking about particular machine learning technologies like predictive typing or protein folding or colon cancer pathology diagnostic assist image analysis. These technologies work on the same principles of machine learning, but they don't require building data centers the size of Manhattan, as OpenAI is planning to do, and they work at a much more modest level than the epic quest of the tech titans to develop artificial general intelligence. I went to a great talk last week here at the Brown School by Karen Howe, who's written a really interesting book about OpenAI and Sam Altman, who's from St. Louis, called Empire of AI, and this was a point that she made, and we'll be reading it in my seminar next semester if people want to take that course.
So We have about 10 minutes left. I wanted to give the audience a chance. If you have questions, otherwise I have a million.
More for you, so, but if anyone, please.
So it's about liability regulation. So one thing we've heard throughout talks this week and through most of the doctrine is that this is the worst these systems will ever be in history. You know, eventually the system will get to beyond 1/3 incorrect or accuracy. And we know that these systems are great at, you know, getting through large swaths of data and analyzing things that humans can't do. What are your thoughts on a very real future where a doctor or clinician might be responsible or liable for not using a system? To where a patient might say, this gets things better and empirically more correct than you can. And what issues do you think will arise in a system where we hold someone liable for not using the tool?
Yeah,
So, something we talk about in healthcare is, or health law, when we think about medical malpractice, we think about what's the standard of care, but there's a resources-based understanding of what that standard of care is. So when we say, well, is the standard of care at Barnes Jewish Hospital a large teaching hospital with more resources than a struggling rural hospital, right? Maybe that doesn't have residents, that doesn't have sort of a broader set of sort of care medical professionals. Is the standard of care is the same, but what we can expect as a matter of liability from those two actors is different, right? And so the courts will say, you know, it's not legally required that you have the latest and greatest X-ray machine, MRI, PET scan, whatever it is, because we understand that not all facilities will be able to afford it. Now, your practices must reflect that, right? If you think a patient needs some sort of device or procedure that you can't offer, right, that has to be reflected in the care or the recommendations that you provide. But to the extent that these have not yet become the standard, right? Or if they do, it's still for now limited to highly resourced medical systems with the ability to even roll these things out, right? It could take a very long time for that to be understood as part of the standard of care, because our current system does account for what are the differences in resources between institutions.
Of course, the popular saying in the AI for health world is AI will not replace doctors, but doctors and institutions that use AI responsibly will replace those who do not. Right. So the idea is AI is going to be so powerful, right? It's going to enhance our capability to diagnose and treat so dramatically that there's just no reason for you to be a good enough, effective enough doctor without the AI co-pilot. Now, a related question is how do you make the AI technology more sort of accessible, right? So this is why exactly back to Neil's point, right? You shouldn't be every hospital have to be able to run a data center in order to run these AI locally, or you have to pay OpenAI a ton of money every year in order to afford AI, right? There's actually a lot of push, including again, my own group's work is trying to make these AI models smaller, right? More efficient and runs on just regular computers, but still as accurate and as effective.
Yeah, two things. One, I think I'm not sure that I mean, you said that the systems are getting better, but I think it's worth asking ourselves what we mean by better. Right? I assume you meant that at a technical level, in terms of technical benchmarking, and that might be true. Though, as we've seen, right, there've been certain recent the sycophantic release of ChatGPT-5 was not better. I don't think internet search is better with AI assistant than it was before. And then I think we also have to ask, even if a system performs better according to some technical specification, how that system is embedded in socio-technical systems, right? In terms of, do we just get rid of hospitals or doctors and just have an AI diagnostic work? I mean, that will continue to get better. Will it ever be as good as a human doctor? It'll probably be a lot cheaper than a human doctor. I think we have to worry about access to care issues for across society, including for everybody apart from the super rich. And the second thing is, and I think we can take some solace from this, we've been here before. I'm fond of saying, in terms of massive social change, we had the Industrial Revolution and we learned a lot about how to regulate there. But we've been here before with computers. I was in law school between 1994 and 1997, which is when the web broke onto society in a very similar way and with a similar level of hype that AI has broken onto society during your time in law school. And is the internet better than it was in 1994? Well, yeah, I mean, there's a lot more graphics and there's more cool stuff you can do. It's destroyed newspapers, it's broken democracy, it's caused a mental health epidemic. And I think we have to be mindful that we don't, and I wasn't taking your question as doing this, that we don't confuse technical specifications of higher performance or higher accuracy according to some benchmark with the arguably the more important question of how we embody these tools in society in general, in the healthcare system in particular. Who are the winners? Who are the losers? And do we have a better healthcare system? That's the real question, and that includes questions of access and affordability and fairness, rather than is the number of throughput cycles or the confidence interval in the outputs higher according to some benchmarking tool.
I'm gonna sound a note of, oh, that's exciting, of partial optimism and maybe partial caution, and then I'm gonna run out of the room because I have to teach in 6 minutes, and several of you are in my class in 6 minutes. So, one thing that we sometimes talk about in health law is, and health policy in general, is we say, well, we're concerned about the cost of the healthcare system. We might like to decrease the cost of the healthcare system. We're concerned about the quality. We might like to increase the quality. And we're concerned about access. There's a lot of people who don't have access, right, for the reasons that we've already heard, and we might like to increase access. But we usually think that there's trade-offs between those things, right? You can expand access, you can increase quality, but it costs money, or you can decrease costs, but maybe you're decreasing access or quality at the same time. If you're being your most optimistic about AI, you can think it has the potential to break this sort of trade-off relationship. You can think we can expand access, improve quality, and we can do so at lower cost. And that's the hope. That's the sort of most optimistic version that I can have about this. One, I'm personally not quite there yet. And one reason is that we've seen a lot of other healthcare technologies rolled out, some medical drugs, devices, right, other types of resources that have the potential to do this, but actually they haven't been rolled out in this way. They benefit the people who already have insurance or access to well-resourced healthcare systems, and they don't benefit the people who lack any of those things. So that's a concern that I have, but AI does have the potential, unlike most things in medicine, to actually resolve that trade-off. We're just not there yet.
Well, with that said, and knowing that people do have to go to class here in 5 minutes,
To have the last word, I just meant to have
you timed it perfectly. So
to be done.
I want to thank the panelists.